the video podcast where we have a chance to talk to leaders in planning and policy who are helping make Texas a better place to live. Today, we have a chance to talk with Jaime Gonzalez, who is the Houston Conservation Programs Manager at the Nature Conservancy in Texas, formerly Community Conservation Director at Katy Prairie Conservancy, and co-founder of the Coastal Prairie Partnership. He received his Master of Education and his BS in Biology, both from the University of Houston. Jaime is passionate about developing a love and knowledge of environmentalism in Hispanic children and increasing diversity in environmental education. Jaime believes humanity is a part of nature and that transit and cities need to care about conservation policy, and his work for the Nature Conservancy of Houston emphasizes this important connection. Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we love having all kinds of people on this podcast, but I'm specifically looking forward to this one because, as you know, my interests are in environmental policy, so I nerd out about all this stuff as well. So we have some general questions that we want to ask you about just being a policy professional. So first off, what do you wish that someone had told you when you were first getting started in public policy?
Actually, I have grown into doing more policy work because I came in as a conservation biologist. A lot of my early projects were really about habitat restoration, and then it morphed into environmental education and then environmental communications, and then now getting into some policy work. I wish that somebody would have kind of road mapped out for me how all of these pieces fit together. So the levers of persuasion or action. So, when I came in as a young professional, nobody said, here's systems thinking, and this is how all this fits together. You're doing your one job in your one silo, but I was always interested in finding out how all the pieces fit. So I think that that's one thing, especially with smaller nonprofits, that would really benefit early career professionals is to see the whole picture, at least in schematic form, to see how it all kind of works together in synchrony.
So you were saying that you're kind of like a recent convert to the policy world. Were there any new skills that you found you needed in order to learn to adjust to the policy world as opposed to some of the fields that you've been in before?
Yeah, and so with my current position, I use lots of different things to get done what I need to get done. So policy is a piece of it, but on the ground projects, I tend to think of it as the 3 Ps. It's like people, projects, and persuasion. So that's the communications part of it. And so I think that what you're trying to do is you're constantly trying to change dynamics, but you're also trying to just change the enabling conditions on the ground to make it easier for you to operate. So policy is, and that's something else I think as people come along in their careers, is just learning when and how to use what tool in the tool bag. Policy is not good for everything. It's good for many things, and it can certainly change the kind of the environment in which you work from a strategic standpoint. But I think that's part of it, is just figuring out, for me anyway, because I have limited time, where can I click into policy work? And where does it make the most sense versus where can I put a project on the ground that inspires people to do more of that work, or where can I inspire people to go do that work? So it's always a matter of discernment.
Yeah, I'm completely with you on that. With my background in communications as well, that's part of the reason why I pursued both on a master's level, is because I recognized that policy is a mechanism of change, but it can't do everything. And part of getting policy off the ground is getting people behind you, and
That's
getting
right.
people behind you involves talking to them and persuading them and understanding like where they're coming from and what level do you need to engage with them on. So yeah, that's wonderful connection to me. But so, and in terms of, since the 3 of us here, apart from August, who's our resident transportation nerd, the 3 of us here are interested in environmental policy. What advice do you think would be most important for young people like us entering the field in the next few months or years? Are there any trends that you've noticed, or like delicate topics you might warn us about?
I think the biggie is that, and many of you already have seen this. So as we move into, when I started, there was not this robust conversation about equitable financing of resilience and other things. It was somewhat there a little bit, but it has really accelerated very quickly. And it's accelerated so quickly that in some ways it's kind of jarring to
Yeah.
the current political structure. And there's a lot of sturm and drum about who gets the money and all these. So all these policies are, a lot of it is being driven by social vulnerability and equality and who gets what, and also like how can we work to dismantle things that were put up a long time ago. um, and so I think that for me that's really a beautiful thing for traditional conservation. And I came from a traditional conservation background to now be trying to reassemble with the EJ movement in some ways.
Yeah.
It's not that easy. There are many things that need to be done, but I think that looking at conservation, in my case anyway, and how you build resilient, healthy cities is really there's a real synthetic moment right now where a lot of things that have been artificially separate for a long time are coming back together. And I don't call this integration, I call this reintegration, because in a lot of ways humanity was already there and then we broke apart and got into these silos.
Yeah.
So the goal is to actually reintegrate some of these things around nature conservation and the environment. So
you're in this kind of joint area where you work in kind of a lot of different levels and a lot of different fields, engaging different people. What do you think is some of the advantages or disadvantages of working in that kind of a role versus in a more like traditional policy making role for this sort of work that you do?
well, I think it's just like with everything. If you can work at depth at anything and get that expertise, you can be extremely useful to other people in other disciplines. Um, my style has always been a little bit to be the utility player, like in baseball, to be able to play different bases and positions and things like that. I like to see how everything fits together. But what it doesn't allow me to do, right, is to go super in depth into something. Fortunately, with the Nature Conservancy and other bigger groups that have really skilled professionals in communications, in policy, government relations, all these things, I can tap into those folks when I need to have some better understanding. And also, if they need some action to happen on the ground, I'm a face in the community, and I can help them kind of steer and navigate and miss some of the barriers. So I think every individual has to have their own sense of how comfortable they are with going a certain depth. For me, because of the type of work that I do, I have to know something about a lot of different things because I'm trying to intersect a lot of different fields into something. Frankly, this new form of conservation is just a field we're building. It's like building a rocket as we're going to the moon. We haven't figured. We're literally putting this together, and so I have to draw from a lot of different things, and it keeps me mentally active because I like learning about a lot of things. Education. You asked earlier about what I would tell you at the beginning of your career. A lot of times in the policy field, unfortunately, sometimes there's not that generational through line. So it's very heavy on what adults will do, but it doesn't really reach down into earlier ages, and certainly rarely goes down to like oftentimes to early childhood but we're trying to create this sustainable, durable society, and without that you have this herky-jerky approach to how to kind of build a society. So I think thinking more like cathedral builders in policy making, knowing that you're going to have generations come through, I think that would be helpful instead of kind of shorter level policy.
Yeah. And I think that that's especially important in any sort of policy that involves the environment, because the point that we're at now, it's not a set set of conditions that is going to stay static. Like things are changing very quickly, not for the better. And so keeping in mind that generational equity and payoff is really important in getting people involved in that. And I'd like to think that young people are very engaged in this issue. But not everybody has the time to get really in depth with, how does this, work in cities, and what can we do that doesn't just involve, donating to Texas Parks and Wildlife and Environment Texas and those types of things. So what do you most often wish that people who are not familiar with urban ecology understood about it?
Well, I think the thing that I would pull back a little bit further than urban ecology. When I think of cities work, I think of it in regional terms. So everything from the Gulf of Mexico to the headwaters of it's all an intersected system.
Right.
And so first of all, I would just like to impress upon the fact that all of these things, our transportation systems, our water systems, our political systems, all these things, our biological, they're all linked up, right? Yeah. So, and that's a real thing in this field, is to want to say, well, here's urban work and here's preserve work and here's coastal work. And I'm like, those geographies actually don't exist in the real world. So let's not make them programmatic. And I also think that there's a real opportunity, and Jay and I had a great fortune of working on a couple of conferences where we were trying to break down silos between disciplines because of the way that the world was kind of put together. And so, I don't think I answered your question, but I hope that there was something in there that was worth something.
Yeah, no, I think that's an answer to the question, that understanding urban ecology is a small piece of the puzzle that is understanding our environment generally and what our places in the environment are, and understanding that all of these systems that seem to be segregated are only segregated because of bureaucratic, agencies. They're not actually physically in the real world segregated systems. They're all intertwined. So no, I think you answered it.
Well, there's one other clarity thing that I wanted to answer before I get to Madeline's thing. Here's one gigantic, I don't want to be hyperbolic. This is a gigantic reframing for the human species that we need to extremely quickly come up to speed. So obviously climate change is an existential threat. We all know that. A lot of my work is really to make the region more climate ready. But there's another thing happening right now, and that is that there is a mass extinction going on. And here's the thing that all policymakers, regardless of where they're working, needs to know. So the UN put out in 2015 the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and I know that you guys know about that. So there are 44 goals. So there was a report put out last year that looked, it was a meta-analysis of lots of different decline studies amongst biodiversity, wildlife, plant life across the planet. And basically the upshot is that we are in a little bit of a biodiversity free fall, and we may lose 1 million species by mid-century. Well, here's why people who could not care less about bugs and beetles and frogs should care. If that were to occur, fully 35 of the 44 goals would be very negatively impacted. So here's the thing. We have not been thinking about other species when we make policy. Never once, when I get into policy discussions about resiliency, about urban planning, about transportation, when I get into these rooms with all these experts, there is no one to speak for the biodiversity. They have no voice. And yet, the quality of the environments in which that they help to regulate will help to determine our future stability as a species. And so, if I could tell policymakers anything, it's stop acting like we're the only species on Earth, because it is going to kill us if we do that. And it's also going to kill them. And that's not ethical either. But even if you're just working from pure selfishness, pay attention to biodiversity conservation, because it will come back to bite us.
Actually, I wanted to jump in last time, and if that's okay.
I
that really like resonated with me because we've spent some time in some of my like environmental classes talking about like green and brown problems and how like brown problems will most likely be what people want to attach to because they affect humans. They're involving maybe environmental degradation, but they'll eventually affect us. And I hate that that's kind of where we have to think. But unfortunately, I think a lot of humans do believe that, oh, we have this knowledge and we have this ability to do all these kind of things. And so, like, you know, it'll be fine. But truly, if we don't focus on these really green problems that are occurring, I mean, we will suffer. And so I've just really resonated with me because it's so frustrating trying to articulate that sometimes to people. So that was very helpful to hear that.
I guess I'm going back a little bit. I have too many questions. I'm so excited. But I guess my background is in natural resources management, and I went to a program that was at a very rural school. And so most of my classmates and even myself were from rural areas and understood conservation from like more of a rural wilderness hunting and fishing out in the middle of nowhere perspective. And I think it has been really nice for me to like spend more time in urban areas and see how nature sort of interacts with people a little differently. So I would say working in conservation and in nature education in a city, what do you wish that professionals who worked in other areas, like a lot of parks and reserves are really far away from population centers. So what do you wish more people in the profession understood about ecology and nature and working with the public in cities?
Yeah, you have a lot of questions. I have a lot of answers for this because I think about it a lot. One thing that I would say is nature's a right. I really do believe that. And so when we're looking to bring nature at scale to cities and towns and suburbs, a lot of times it gets boiled down to what are we going to do to, in my mind, to save people's bodies? So how can we cool the city because of urban heat effects? Or what can we do to prevent flooding to save people from getting flooded? Those are all things that we work on. They're super critical, and I get it. But another part of it is that if you grow up in a neighborhood where you don't have a ranch, you don't have a home in Maine, you can't get away to Colorado as affluent Texans can, that nature is all you got. And I had the real kind of duality growing up. I grew up north of Houston in a place called Aldine Greenspoint, which was very wild at the time. And I was there till about 8th grade. And then in high school, I went and we moved back to the neighborhood I was born in, is North Philadelphia. And North Philadelphia is the grayest neighborhood you will ever see. I mean, there is so little nature there that it will stun you. And grayness and hardness and concrete has all sorts of bad effects on mental health and physical health in terms of self-esteem, self-efficacy, depression rates, just all sorts of things. But also, as a kid who grew up outside playing in the woods and the bayous and the prairies, I missed that very old and ancient relationship between myself and nature. I oftentimes tell people, like, nature is a relationship that existed before we were human beings. To think that you can strip nature out of any community and that those people are going to be okay is extremely short-sighted. So as we rebuild cities to make them greener, as we rewild these spaces to help us become more resilient, we just got to also remember that for many kids, that is going to be their Amazon, their Yosemite, all of that. And I take that very seriously. So for instance, when we look at access to green space, like in the Trust for Public Lands Park Score, they do really great work. I'm not complaining about it, but a lot of times it's like, where is the local park? And that'll tell you if people have access to green space. For me, that's not quite sufficient. I want to know, yes, where's the local park but does that park have a truly wild area where people can actually experience some of the rhythms of nature, some of the seasonality of nature, some of the wild creatures of nature, so that there is a leveling effect? And right now we're working on a project that kind of flips the paradigm on a school campus. Instead of building a school and then having overworked teachers build small gardens that kids interact in, which I've done for 22 years, flip it, create a giant amount of nature as the campus and situate the school in there. And that would have a leveling effect, especially in preschool where we're working on this campus. So, I think that there's a relatively new construct called One Health. And One Health is, I tell people that One Health really is both the oldest idea in the world for humans and the newest idea in community health. And that is that the health of humans, ecosystems, and wildlife are all interlinked. And so when we do public policy, when we do planning, when we do projects, we end up with the worst results when we don't recognize that that's actually a basic fact of the planet and always has been. When our policy works against our biology, that's when we get into trouble. And that goes for, Jay and I used to talk a lot about civic spaces and the role of civic spaces. Well, that's just a nod to the fact that we're social mammals whose habitat is way better when we have great civic spaces that code for interactions. This is not, I don't want to be flip about it, but every time we move against evolution, it moves against us.
I'd like to respond to that. I think for me, this is I'm with you in that this is one of the main things that frustrates me about engaging with anybody else who might be interested in environmental policy is the misunderstanding that we are somehow separate and like above nature, that we have this ability because we're human beings and we've created, cities and schools and we have like higher reasoning power or whatever, that we are thus able to basically do whatever we want, or that if we are trying to preserve the environment should only be because it will harm us in the long run. When like really my concern is the health of the planet, whether or not humanity makes it or not. I'd love it if humanity would make it. That'd be great if I could have like children and they would have children, but I'm ultimately concerned.
I have a 5-year-old and Jay has a 5-year-old or 6-year-old?
6 now, 6, yeah.
So we got to say, I'm just going to put this out there. We got to save the planet.
Yeah.
And like, I think that's one of the most frustrating things is engaging with people who have this misunderstanding that we are not somehow just one part of a very large system. And I think anybody who's ever been like alone, far from civilization in the wilderness can feel how small we really actually are in the grand scheme of things, even though we seem like giants when we live in places where there's only other human beings. So I think that the next question that I want to ask you is about the intertwined systems. So similar to public policy, the natural world is full of complex intertwined systems. And because of this complexity, solutions to one environmental concern might exacerbate another. And one of the things that we often hear from people who are really passionate about helping the environment, but not necessarily very familiar with environmental systems, is that, if somebody could be harming the environment in a general sense with their advocacy, but they might just be advocating for something different that might be at odds with what that person thinks we should do. So how do we balance these misunderstandings of each other, and how much of this is unavoidable because people have different goals?
Yeah, if I'm getting your question right, I think there's a couple things. I think sometimes what I have seen is that there's a great schism between the traditional conservation movement and the environmental justice movement. Mm-hmm. One is seen to be working for a cleaner environment on behalf of humans, the EJ movement, and justice and equality. And then one is seen to be, working on behalf of creating this complex of landscapes and biodiversity. And I think that, I actually got into a conversation once with somebody at a meeting about how the county is going to look at resilience. And I said, well, nobody's speaking up for the other species, more than 4,000 species in the county, so I'm going to go ahead and speak up for them. And this EJ person who's very passionate, does really great work, just it's a distraction. You're gonna keep us from really getting to our issues. And so I said, well, I hate to bring this up, but the first principle in the HEMAS principles of environmental justice is don't destroy the earth and the rest of the species on the planet, because everything that humans have is dependent on keeping the spaceship alive. Let's just be honest. So the reason we're on this call instead of in person is we violated that rule by going into a habitat, extracting wildlife, putting them into markets, and a spillover happened of a virus that has literally shut the world down. If this isn't the lesson that we learn from this,
I hope so.
Boy, pity on us if we didn't learn that we hurt the earth, and guess what? She struck back. And so, I think that, and that's where I think educational policy is so important, because there is nowhere in probably any of our educations where they brought it down to the level of, I was never told this in all the schooling that I've ever done, through K through 12, that my existence on this planet is due to other species. I never got that message. And that seems like message number one you get in kindergarten is your destiny as a biological creature is wrapped up with everything else. Don't screw it up. And I tell people, like, whether you believe in the Bible or not, really the first job that in that biblical account is, here you go. Here's the earth. Tend the garden. Don't screw it up, because it's the operating system for the computer, right?
Right.
And I think that when we get out of this like environment versus humanity, that false dichotomy it's stunning, because the economic system does not match up with the actual biogeochemical realities, in my opinion. It's a mismatch.
This is kind of an impromptu question that I didn't submit to you beforehand, but I'm interested to know where you fall on this, because I know that one of the most contentious debates I have found as a young person in the policy world around environmental policy is that, for me personally, like I want to be as conscious of my personal effect on the environment as I can be. So like I compost and I'm vegan and I do all the things I can. I'm low waste, do what I can. And I'm often met with a lot of pushback that it shouldn't be about individual actions, but about these broad stroke actions and systemic actions, and corporations taking the ownership of their waste and the military waste and all of that stuff, which I also agree with. But my personal opinion is that we should do both. Where do you kind of fall on this spectrum?
Yeah, no, I think it has to be both. And here's why. And I meet this all the time, by the way, in the conservation field, which is, so one of the questions is, do you do carbon sequestration projects in the city? So, a biomathematician or somebody will come in and say, well, there's only so much land where you can plant trees, and it's this relatively small amount, and the big victories are going to be on the rural areas and blah, blah, blah. I said, well, okay. Almost 90% of Texans are urban. They are living in the city. They got to make it real. They got to internalize it. They got to, it's got to resonate, and they got to have skin in the game. So you can tell me that, but what's your plan for getting these massive urban populations excited about climate action? Mine is to put some projects in the city and to interpret them and use them as models and points of inspiration. And so it really has to be both. People have to internalize that. And yes, we need that global action, but I think that's a matter of scaling in a lot of ways. If you're constantly working at the national or international level, and you're looking for these giant needles to be moving back and forth, and you're not down on the ground doing literal projects, it's easy to stay up here and think about that. And if you're down on the ground, truthfully, it's easy to think, if I fix this park, if I fix this wetland, I'm fixing the earth, without getting all of this. And so the real challenge, I think, in terms of that false dichotomy of either or, is really having ways for those policymakers and the people that are working at 30,000 feet to really cross-pollinate with the people on the ground so that you can drive change both ways, because that's how it works in the real world. But there's not enough opportunity for those kinds of peoples to mix. And that's what I would like to see more of.
I agree. And I think that another great effect of doing that kind of work and scaling that way would be that, you know, as a lot of young people have a lot of climate anxiety. And I think that being able, I know for me personally, like choosing to compost and buy as little plastic as I can and replace things with metal and with natural fibers is, for me, makes it feel like I'm actually able to do something about it, because it's this really huge, like you said, existential threat that is just scary on both a personal level, like, you know, am I going to make it throughout my life and be able to have children who are healthy and see the planet healthy, but also on this grand scale of just like, how do you do anything about this as a single person? So I think that that would be really useful for people to sort of tame that anxiety, is being able to say, like, you know what, I helped plant 30 trees, and that might not be very much in the grand scheme of the global planet, but for me that feels like I'm doing something. And if you have one person who plants 30 trees and, you know, 500 people do that, that's a lot of trees. So I think that that's one of the things that I'm really passionate about pushing for in my career, is getting people to be more hands-on and to think of it as a personal fight and not just this like large scale type of thing.
Well, and the truth is, you're absolutely right. This planet's not going to be saved as a planet. It's going to be saved community by community, block by block. This is a street fight. And so this notion that we're going to set these global targets and those, you know, we got to only work in that kind of thing, that's a function of the people working at that stage and their world and their lens. But the truth is, it really is going to be one place by place by place, by yard, by, you know, like I plant my whole front yard in a wildflower patch every year to get people better connected with their history, their culture, and their ecology. And, you know, I actually heard from a friend, like, what difference does that do? I was like, well, what difference is keeping your yard in a cut to within an inch of its? I said, people need models, they need inspiration, they need, like, to your point, they need skin in the game. And what I tell people is, we're going to have to solve the climate crisis, which is extremely complicated crisis, but we're going to have to stay sane while we do it. And we're not going to stay sane if we don't have, to your point, outlets for releasing this anxiety. And so having people do these things is anxiety reducing. And I think that's a good mental health strategy as we combat these hard problems.
Okay, I know some of the other interns have some questions for you, so I'm going to turn it over.
Yeah, so I've really enjoyed just listening. And this one kind of has more to do with kind of like funding and getting kind of like awareness out there. So as we've been looking at, a lot of the funding for like state level land and habitat conservation has been historically funded through this kind of like federal excise taxes from hunting and fishing, and then distributed kind of throughout the state based on these like license sales. But a lot of this activity has declined over time, and then other kind of recreational uses have been increased. And so there's kind of two questions. How much do you personally think these uses might recover with wider outreach, mentorship, and access? And then will we need to drastically rethink how we handle funding for state agencies, or can these gaps be made up through NGOs and like nonprofits and places like the Nature Conservancy who work through these like other means?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think that we need to rethink and reframe how we finance conservation. You know, anglers and hunters and folks who have traditionally paid for the conservation movement are in decline, and this revenue is not going to be in the future what we know it is right now. You know, fortunately, there are new funding pots coming online, like the Great American Outdoors Act was signed last week, very powerful. One thing that I've been tracking pretty closely, not with TNC, but with another hat that I have on, is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And that's a fantastic piece of legislation that could mean like $50 million more to go to our state agency, Texas Parks and Wildlife, a lot of it would be passed through. A lot of people don't even know that. Like, they will, fill spots that they need and do what they need, but they're perceiving that a lot of that will also just pass through to other groups doing conservation work. So we need a diversified sweep. But here's the real challenge. This is how we get there ultimately. We need to diversify the sorts of people who care about conservation. Right now, and I'm writing an essay on this right now because it's gotten kind of to a critical point. Right now, the conservation movement, the environmental movement, is a niche of a niche of a niche. So if you look at one thing you guys should download is fascinating is, if you've ever heard of Giving USA, Giving USA puts out a report every year on how much money goes to what sector within philanthropy. So right now, the category called animals in the environment gets about 3% of those dollars. This means that the conservation movement is so niche that it can't even hit 5%. Part of the reason it's niche is it has not diversified quickly enough. It has not reached out to city populations and the people who are there, and they predominate the number of people in the state. And so really the only way to get out of this jam with conservation is to make this a much broader and bigger tent that it is right now. It is not well coordinated with the faith community that's doing some things. It's not particularly well established with urban communities. It is relying on a fairly small niche suite of donors, very small. I'm talking about not diverse. And so one of the ways to do that is, getting back to our conversation earlier, is through a health lens. If we can see it as conservation as a community health practice, it will open it up to many more dollars than it's getting right now. And also it'll increase its relevance to everybody who wants to live a little bit more healthfully. So I think part of it is conservation needs to be recast for the 21st century and not be such a silo, because then we can find the money that we'll need to do these things.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I absolutely agree with you. I definitely struggled with that in the environmental education space when you work for either nonprofits or organizations that are really running off of funding from basically rich white old people. So
pretty much that's pretty much it. A niche of a niche of a niche.
Yeah.
And I just really want to draw all listeners' attention back to Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Please go look into that, and then call all your legislators about it, because it's great.
Well, and if you can check out a website called Texas Alliance for Wildlife. I'll put it in the chat, but they are kind of tracking it here in the state, and they can tell you exactly which Congress people have signed on to be co-sponsors. They're still looking for co-sponsors.
Madeline, are you next, or are we going to August?
So I am a transportation person. That is what I am interested in most of all. And most of the, or I guess it's, my major lens that I am looking at things through. So I was hoping to talk a little bit about transportation specifically and how we can better, think of other species in the transportation world. I wonder if for you that means, where we plan roads, or more like the general land use that we're planning for.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there are three things that come to mind. One is placement of roads is real key. One of the things that I got a chance to do here is work with a really talented group at the Houston Galveston Area Council, which is an MPO. Years ago, Jay, I can't remember if you were on that team that put together the first ecological map. But basically, it's a land cover map for the Harris and surrounding counties, and the purpose of it was to kind of have a tool for planners and transportation experts to take a look at where the ecosystems were. Now, I'm not sure if it was ever used or how much it was used or whatever, What it does do for us is it gives conservationists and people who are excited about conserving wildness or wild places, maybe because it's a way to get creative talent to the city. There's all kinds of reasons to save nature. But I think that is tools like that can help planners think and be more discerning about where they place roads, because where you place a road matters for a lot of different reasons. One of which is like, where are you going to spur development? A lot of times, as Jay knows, it's not the road, it's all the fingers off the road that kill the really high quality habitats. And then there's another big piece that I think is going to find a lot more traction. So, our mayor has really called for more multimodal transportation options. So this is where resiliency, nature, and transportation and health fuse. So we have lots of spaces that, if properly connected by hike and bike trails and other utilities, can be ecological corridors restored, be transportation corridors, and so meet a lot of different needs in one. So one thing I'm looking at right now is power lines. Power lines are about the most useless, besides the power, in terms of and so I think that what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out what it would be like to restore power lines to grasslands, because you can't plant trees under these things, and then to connect those with reforested bayou systems. So what you get is you get this giant grid of ecological services, and you get a giant transportation system to boot, and it can move people across the city more safely, get them off the roads, because even with Vision Zero, it's pretty dangerous out there. So I think part of my thought is, whenever we're doing this planning, is that one-use landscapes have got to go. One-use landscapes are very wasteful. They need to work as hard as we work. And so if we can have a power line full of prairie plants that soaks up more water, soaks up more carbon, provides habitat for monarchs and bees, and connects people, frankly, to their Texas history, then we're getting to a smarter place, because all those investments are leveraging a lot more value.
We have taken up enough of your time, but you have been so amazing, and you've given us a lot to really think about, and I think the listeners will have a lot to engage with as well. Is there anything that you would like to add that you'd just like to get out there that we didn't cover?
Yeah, I think one thing that's gonna come out of this whole experience, unfortunate with the pandemic, is a renewed interest in assuring that that all people get a healthy dose of nature, both for their physical well-being and their mental well-being. So we're really looking at that here in the city of Houston. It is come into stark relief. All inequalities have come into stark relief. What's called the nature gap has really come into stark relief because of what we talked about earlier. Some people not being able to go anywhere and being stuck in their neighborhood, and those neighborhoods not having adequate facilities in the first place. So I think part of a thriving community, one that people want to be a part of, is ensuring that nature gap gets closed. And we're really excited that we can make the city more resilient, while at the same time providing the awe factor that nature provides. I always think it's kind of funny that we take our 1 or 2 weeks of vacation and we go out somewhere really wild and majestic, and then we go, okay, 52 more weeks back home, not so wild. It's like, what? Why are you making this choice?
Yeah.
You can make your city much more beautiful and much more wild, and actually live in the city of London actually became the first national park city here recently. They actually signed off on a bunch of different policy and procedural targets to really transform the city into a more wild and scenic and healthy place. And I brought this up here with some folks here recently. Houston, it's like, yeah, we could do that. Instead of building one amusement park, which costs $1 bajillion that only the folks who can afford to go will go, why not make the whole damn city an amusement park that everybody can use? right? So anyway, I'll just leave you with that.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. Keep in mind that what our cities were before they were cities was landscape, and there's no reason that they couldn't return to that in some ways. And obviously it would have to look different, but it's possible. And I think we should all be imagining a radically hopeful future. And even if we don't meet even half of that, we'll still be 10 times better than where we are now.
That's right.
Well,
thank
you very much for being on with us and for all of your wonderful insight. We've really enjoyed talking to you, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
All right. Thank you, guys. Great seeing
Thanks
you
so
all.
much,
and thank you for sharing your time.
And cut.
Cut. All right.